Welcome to the first video interview with the National Association of Scholars 1620 project. I'm delighted to welcome Professor H.W. Brands, who I will be referring to as Bill going forward. Bill, Professor Brands, is the Jack S. Blanton Chair in History at the University of Texas in Austin. He's worked, according to his wonderful CV, as a traveling salesman, taught math and history in high school, and he has written more than 30 books of political, diplomatic, and economic history. His most recent book, I believe, is Heirs of the Founders, the epic rivalry of Henry Clay, John Calhoun, and Daniel Webster, the second generation of American giants, which I think just came out in 2018. And the essay—
I could interrupt you there. I've got a new book coming out just in 3 weeks. It's Dreams of El Dorado, and it's a history of the American West.
Ooh, nifty.
So maybe by the time that this airs or gets posted, that book will be out.
Lovely. All right, glad to blurb that one and maybe even get it on my Amazon cart for Christmas. Bill's essay for the 1620 project is on the history of American enterprise, and therefore I'm going to mention two more of his many books. Masters of Enterprise, Giants of American Business, from John Jacob Astor and J.P. Morgan to Bill Gates and Oprah Winfrey. And then also American Colossus, The Triumph of Capitalism, 1865 to 1900. And I'm going to do an introduction for viewers. The 1620 project, what this is about. The New York Times published, by this point, it's about a month ago or so, late August, early September, the 1619 project. That's a series of essays and articles which aims centrally to retell the history of America as about slavery and oppression. The most inflammatory single sentence, I would say, is our founding ideals of liberty and equality were false when they were written. And it includes, and I'll mention this in particular because it speaks to Professor Brand's own essay and expertise, an essay by Matthew Desmond, which in effect claims that you can't understand American capitalism without looking at the history of the plantation. The reason we're doing our 1620 project is, well, one, we think this history is wrong in details, wrong in the attention and the amount of significance it gives to stuff it says, which is, when it is correct. And we're afraid it's going to be very influential for, high school history, college history, and we sort of want to gather various scholars, not all on the same page, not engaged in a whitewash of American history, but simply unhappy about one aspect or another of the 1619 project, whether it just doesn't say enough or whether it's specifically wrong. So that's all the introduction. I'm going to ask Bill, did you read the 1619 project in part or all?
Yes. And if I could add my take on it.
Oh,
I have no objection to studying the role of history, the role of slavery in American history. The objection that I have with the 1619 project is what I see as the overemphasis on slavery to the exclusion of very much else. So the statement that liberty and equality were false from the start, well, that's true enough, certainly. And liberty and equality in the United States, as elsewhere, have always been works in progress. But to suggest that they didn't mean anything at all, I think is quite false. But it's again the idea that slavery is the touchstone for everything else that happens in American history is, I think, wrong in its emphasis. And I agree with you. I'm concerned as a longtime teacher of American history that it will do one of two things, maybe both, in different parts of the country, that it will lead to a revamping of the curriculum where the students sort of start with slavery and continue as though that has determined everything else, which I think is wrong and misleading. But secondly, it will simply confirm in the minds of people already disposed to believe that historians, especially academic historians, are liberal America haters, that, yeah, that's exactly what they're up to. And so, and I disagree with that vehemently.
Oh, okay. So I want to wander improvisatorily. So you're also saying that this isn't reflecting the historical profession properly.
Yes, I think. I mean, there are lots of historians looking at lots of areas of American history, and in any given era, there is one or a few areas that seem to gain the most attention. And at the moment, on the 400th anniversary of the institution of slavery, it makes perfect sense to look at the role of slavery. But I think it'd be quite a mistake for people on the outside to think that all historians are doing is investigating the role of slavery, and with it, the notion that everything they've been taught to believe about the United States is wrong.
I'm going to follow up. What, for you, is some of the most exciting new works in American history being done right now?
Sort of in general?
Yeah, well, it can be your field of expertise, but in general, sure.
I teach at the University of Texas in Austin, and one of the very active areas at my university, but also in my part of the country, are the role of borders and borderlands and frontiers and places where different people meet, interact, intersect, engage in violence, engage in cooperation. So this is an area that is very fruitful. It is especially so, I think, in restoring the role of what was originally the Spanish Southwest, or in the Southwest of the United States, the northern reaches of the Spanish Empire, restoring it to a position of chronological precedence in American history. The Spanish were in what would become the American Southwest before the English arrived in Virginia and Massachusetts. And to me, this is one of the most active and interesting areas of history, because one of the things that it does better than almost any other realm of history is that it really does bring in scholars from different disciplines. We in the academy have paid lip service to interdisciplinary studies for a long time. But when you deal with borderlands, you find anthropologists and archaeologists and historians and sociologists all working together, and the work of each contributing to the results of everyone else.
I'm going to ask them a specific question. So how does it change your view of the history of enterprise? I mean, is the history of enterprise not modeled on the plantation in Jamestown, but a rancho in Texas?
That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is as the pursuit of the natural physical resources of the West. So, for example, in any history of American enterprise, the California Gold Rush plays a huge role. It was one of those things that is delightful for the historian in that it just fell out of the sky, so to speak. There are a lot of things that historians and people who were alive at the time can see coming. The Industrial Revolution didn't sneak up on anybody.
Right.
But the California Gold Rush did, because a day before James Marshall stumbled over that gold in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada in California, no one had any idea that there was gold in California. And all of a sudden, there it was. And it provided this magnet for hundreds of thousands of people from all over the world who flocked to California. And this reoriented the center of gravity of American politics. It basically forced the United States down the path that would lead to the Civil War just a decade later. And in even broader terms, one of the things it made possible was the adoption by the leading countries of the world of a gold standard. Without the discovery, without all the new gold that became available in California, other parts of the American West, and in findings elsewhere in the world that were essentially put in motion by the discovery of gold and gold geology in California, the gold standard never would have taken hold. And so it has, I've sometimes, with maybe forgivable slight exaggeration, said that the California Gold Rush was the first event in modern world history, in the sense of one event that in a very short time frame had influences all over the world.
Yeah, and I will say that I've done British history. There's a great deal on how the living standards of British workers were just really grim in many ways, 1830s, 1840s. And yeah, the takeoff is the California and the Australian gold rush. It makes a real difference.
Well, the striking thing about the Australian gold rush is the guy who made the Australian gold rush was a failed gold seeker in California. And he went to California And he couldn't find any gold, but he was looking at the geology of the gold country. And he remembered that he had seen this kind of geology back in Australia. So when his money ran out in California, he went back to Australia and sure enough discovered gold there. And one of the interesting things about that is Australia, having been a penal colony of the British Empire, Australia was one of the few places around the world when people left Australia to go to California. In most places, when towns were depopulated by the immigrants to California, the people who ran the businesses in those towns, the town fathers, were really upset because there goes our business. Australia was the one place where people said, good riddance, let those old felons leave. And then a year and a half later, they all came back.
Yeah. Okay, so let me see. I'm going to circle back a little bit on the details, I suppose, of the 1619 project. Sentences such as, American slavery is necessarily imprinted on the DNA of American capitalism. It's different historians he's quoting, Sven Beckert, Seth Rockman. Accounting comes from how the plantations did accounting. The very definition of freedom in America is a malnourished and mean kind of freedom. Mortgages are based upon mortgages of slaves. The extension of mortgages to slave property helped fuel the development of American and global capitalism. That everything up to the Panic of 2008 recession, it all comes out of the slave capitalism. Just going back, so I've given you a bunch of specific things. Thoughts, comments, shock, agreement.
Well, I will say this, that I don't dispute those points in a certain kind of detail. The fact is that under the American Constitution, American state laws, slaves were property until the 1860s. And they were a large portion of property. And therefore, accounting, mortgages, the legal apparatus of property owning, the acquisition of capital, it was going to involve slaves. Now, I would add that the same thing could be said in even sort of greater import about just, say, not any other American commodity, but land. So land, in fact, was much more widely held than slaves as property. And most mortgages were on land rather than on slaves. And accounting arose from businesses, not simply slave businesses. So a lot of what was described there would have evolved anyway, did evolve anyway in countries for which slavery was not a big deal. Now, the fact is, in the United States, slavery did exist at the time of the emergence of these various aspects of business. So naturally, slavery is involved. If one takes issue with the exploitation of slave labor, as one certainly can, one ought to include the exploitation of other kinds of labor. So, for example, until the beginning of the 19th century, indentured servants were more numerous than slaves in many places, and they were certainly exploited, not in the same ways. It wasn't hereditary, it wasn't permanent. But if the issue is exploitation, there are all kinds of exploitation. If the issue is how is capital accumulated and property acquired, one really ought to start with the expropriation of the lands of the Native Americans. Without that massive expropriation, none of the rest would have taken place. So any historian who wants to argue for the centrality of his or her favorite subject can simply notice where it is situated in time and then connect it to the other things that are developing during that time and contend, see, this has an important influence. And that's true enough, but it's not especially enlightening.
How should a historian proceed to get a proper sense of proportion and, let's say, humility about their own subject?
Well, I give everybody the prerogative to make the case that what they're studying is the most important thing on earth. That's fine. I have no problem with that. But I think that they should accord the same prerogative to others. And fine, if you choose to study this and I choose to study that, well, you do your best with that. You make the best case for that. I'll make the best case for this. But don't sort of impose on others your preference, your views, and don't deny other people the right to make their own case.
All right, well, actually, let's make it a little bit more tricky. let's say we're talking about a textbook of American history. You
Correct.
have to make choices.
Right.
How does one make those choices?
Yeah, this is the issue. When there is a limited bandwidth or real estate in textbooks, for example, then decisions have to be made. This is one where, well, this is what school boards argue about. This is what historians argue about. And I will note that in this case, pedagogy follows trends and fads like pretty much every other kind of human undertaking. So it's certainly fair to say that in the, we'll just say roughly 150 years from the 1860s until now, for much of that time, slavery was underplayed. So if there are people who are going to overplay it now, that's an understandable correction. But just as the underplaying of the role of slavery was not good for students, was not good for their outlook as citizens of the United States, the overplaying of slavery won't be either.
I'm going to say, by the way, I mean, and this is my own, my own personal thing, and I learned about slavery, I would say more or less for, 5, 6. I mean, I was from the time I was learning about history, I learned about it. And I guess I would say it seems to me as if, certainly historians have been paying attention to slavery seriously all my life. And I would have thought textbooks are also giving it pretty fair weight, again, a good part of my life. And I suppose is there a Goldilocks moment when there was the perfect weight given, or let me phrase this a different way, is the 1619 Project ignoring people who have, in point of fact, already paid a great deal of serious, thoughtful attention to the effects of slavery?
At the level of the academic historians, the people who write history and have positions at universities, we have been talking about slavery for a long time. At the level of what shows up in 5th grade textbooks, that's a different matter. And that's really much more influenced by the political culture that surrounds the school boards that devise the curriculum and the like. And I suspect that those people involved in the 1619 Project would probably admit that part of their agenda is to change that political culture so that, to put it metaphorically, if you go to Monticello, it used to be, well, long ago, if you went to Monticello, all you would see was the big house, and you wouldn't see where the slave lived. Lately, if you go to Monticello, you see the big house, and then you're shown where the slaves lived. Now it looks like if you go to Monticello, you see first where the slaves lived, and then the big house.
Right.
So, what is the appropriate balance there? Again, if you are a 5th grade social studies teacher and you have a limited amount of time, I say they got a hard task in front of them. But I wouldn't lead with slavery. I would say that the way I view it is that slavery is not sort of the meaning of the American experiment in self-government. Slavery was a large, important aberration from American values. I would say that the values outlasted slavery. There is, of course, a legacy of slavery, but the direction has always been toward that greater liberty and equality. We're certainly not there yet. We weren't there at the beginning, and we've gotten closer. Sometimes we slide backwards. And it's important to know why we're not there when we have failed. That's where the role of slavery comes in. But I think it's a mistake, both as history and as civics lesson, to say that the whole point of the American experiment was slavery. I think that's simply wrong.
I'm going to shift that question slightly. You're presumably still teaching freshman history classes, surveys.
I do.
When the students arrive, what do you think they know and what do they need to learn? And how has this shifted over your career?
They certainly are fully aware that slavery existed, and slavery was a large part of the American experience. Exactly sort of what the balance they have is, I couldn't tell you. It varies from student to student. I'll share you another shift in view. So I've been teaching long enough to know that there was a time when Andrew Jackson was an admired president. I say this as somebody who grew up in Portland, Oregon, where the public high schools have long been named after presidents. And as late as the 1960s, Portland named a new high school Andrew Jackson High School. Now, Portland is one of the most liberal cities in the country. Today, there is no way that Portland would name a high school for Andrew Jackson.
Right.
I ask school teachers, because I meet with them in various workshops during the summers. So what do your students know about Andrew Jackson? These days, the answer always comes in 3 words: Trail of Tears. Okay? So this is what students know about Andrew Jackson. They don't know that he was the first democratically elected president. They don't know that he was sort of the model of the common man who makes good and gives, essentially makes America a democracy. In theory at that point, not yet fully in practice, but again, something that was quite different than before. So I think that that is a mistaken emphasis on the contribution of Andrew Jackson to American history, but it's definitely an indication of how these cultural shifts take place. Right. So I don't think we're yet to the point, but we might be getting there, where if I ask teachers, what do your students know about Thomas Jefferson? That they would say he owned 200 slaves, and they wouldn't know that he was the author of the Declaration of Independence. We Right. haven't reached that point yet. I think it'll be a sorry state of our profession, teaching and writing, if we do come to that.
Actually, so I asked you about students. I mean, I suppose there's also the question of, what do teachers need to know? And I suppose when they come to you, it's because they are wanting to learn, and perhaps, if I'm politely saying this, needing to learn something. That's why they're having the professional development. Can you say something about changes in the historical knowledge of teachers? K-12 teachers.
Well, I think the teachers know about as much, and I will say as little, with no disrespect to high school teachers, they're busy folks, as they always have. The problem that they have is that they're teaching a curriculum that is pretty much prescribed for them. And they also know that they have a very limited amount of time to deal with any moment in history. They
Right.
all do appreciate that history is more complicated than most people think, but Right. they don't have time to deal with the complications. So they probably have a sentence for Andrew Jackson. And the sentence these days, as I said, is Trail of Tears. And as I explain when I talk about Thomas Jefferson, his complicated legacy, one of the points that I make is that, yes, Thomas Jefferson is this conflicted individual for historians. He was conflicted himself. And how do we square the fact that he's the author of the Declaration of Independence and said all men are created equal and owns hundreds of slaves? And there's a temptation for the modern liberal sensibility to say, that Thomas Jefferson would have been a good guy if just not for the slaves. But the point that I make is if he had not been a slave owner, he never would have been allowed to write the Declaration of Independence. And so in history, you very often can't tease these things apart.
I think I want to switch over a little bit to your own area of expertise and the history of American enterprise. And I want to ask first, what is the distinction between the history of American enterprise and business history?
Business history is typically the history of businesses as institutions. When I talk about the history of American enterprise, it's basically the history of how everybody in this country, historically and now, has had to make a living. How do you make a living? This includes what in the academic realm is sometimes carved off as labor history. It includes a lot of social history. So it is this question of how have people earned their daily bread? And it involves businesses. These are institutions, but they're certainly not the only institutions. It's, as one of the things I say in my essay, that this story has never, or very rare, it has been rarely attempted and never fully been told, because it's in some ways no less than the history of everything Americans have ever done. Because when we talk politics, when we talk any other aspect of history, that's a part-time job for everybody. The full-time job is how do you make a living? And the big attraction to the world, the reason the United States has been a magnet for immigrants from many countries, is that there have been jobs. There have been ways for people to make a living. People come to America seeking the opportunity to make their way. Some come to set up their own businesses. Many come to work in other people's businesses. Farmers were entrepreneurs. So the history of America can be written, I think, very usefully, if not easily, in terms of how have Americans made a living. And one can argue as well that this is what America taught the world. The appeal of America has been very much less, if you ask me, other people would differ, has been very much less the promise of political equality, but the promise of economic opportunity. That's why immigrants come. For every one immigrant who comes for religious or political equality, 100 come for the opportunity to get a better job for themselves and especially for their children.
How much do Americans, or have Americans, thought of themselves as enterprisers in these terms?
Well, America nurtures this myth of the individual, the myth of opportunity, the myth of individual accomplishment. It's a myth, and like most myths, it has a grounding in truth, and there's a lot overlaid on top of it. But when Americans, for example, and a majority of Americans typically say they think government is too big and government ought to get out of the people's way, what they're really saying is leave me alone to make a living on my own. Now, what they think they want, what they say they want, and what they actually would benefit from are often two different things. And in no place, so I've just mentioned, I've got this new book on the American West, in no part of American history, in no part of the United States, has the discrepancy between the myth and the reality been more marked than in the American West. And so the West is seen as the home, if not the birthplace, of American individualism and the rugged cowboy on his horse and riding the range. But in fact, the American West was this creation of the federal government. The American West is where government did more for individuals than for people in any other part of the country. So there's this aspect of what we think we're about and what actually makes our lives possible. And there's often a disconnect between those two.
Now, when you talk about government, so in effect, as I paraphrase you in my words wrongly, it seems as if you're sort of subsuming the whole history of American government and indeed some sort of civil society as sort of an accessory, an ancillary to the history of enterprise. It's sort of the response for when enterprise doesn't quite work out. Am I putting this too strongly?
Too strongly, but you're in the right direction. So in fact, I think the American philosophy of government has been pretty much the philosophy of Abraham Lincoln, who said that government should do what the people cannot do or cannot do so well for themselves. So America, and especially the way Americans view themselves, starts with the individual. And says, okay, if the individual needs help, then we look to government. And if we can bring government in to help us, that's great. But it doesn't start with the community. As I explain to my students, every society has to wrestle with two competing principles. One is the principle of, to use the traditional language, it's every man for himself. And the other one is we're all in this together. And every society at every time has to try to deal with these two competing principles. In the United States, there has been a greater emphasis on the every man for himself than in certain other countries, China, for example. And at times in American history, the every man for himself has seemed more appropriate and more useful than we're all in this together when times are good, during periods of prosperity. But during crises, during wars, during depressions, Americans are quite happy to look to the we're all in this together. And so to look at American enterprise is, to start with the individuals trying to make a living. Now, of course, they draw government in, but it's not, I wouldn't go so far as to sort of claim primacy for one view or the other, except that American history is traditionally organized chronologically by moments in the evolution of government. And so 1776 and 1787 and 1861 and 1865. If one were to look at it in the way people make a living, and those are nice markers for the history books, but in the effect of things on people's daily lives, more important are obviously to come back to the subject of slavery. The Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin is a much bigger deal than anything that happened in Congress or in the Constitutional Convention. Without that, slavery would have remained unprofitable, and it probably would have withered long before it ended.
Right.
So it doesn't exactly turn the model of history on its head, but it looks at it from a different angle. As a historian of the United States, but somebody who's interested in the relation of the United States to the world, I've often wondered, could you write a history using your mental model as a globe with no political boundaries on it at all? And the answer is you could up to a point. Sometimes, though, the political boundaries intrude upon what you're trying to do when tariffs are imposed on trade routes and the like. And the same thing would be true with a history of the United States written from the perspective of enterprise. So, okay, until 1776, the enterprise all takes place within the British Empire. After 1776, people are still doing many of the same things, but the legal and political framework in which they're working has changed. And so you have to take some cognizance of that.
So is the history of Reconstruction more important for how the state governments of the South redo their business law?
Actually, I would say, looked at from this perspective of enterprise, it's really how the economy, the feudal economy of the South, is integrated into the industrial economy of the North. And the states are part of that. The federal government is part of that. But the driving force is, can industrial and financial capitalism of the North spread its influence into the South and bring it in on terms that can make profits for the powers that be in the existing economy?
So who's the one person we should study to get insight into that? Or
Reconstruction, or just the whole thing?
The extension of industrial capital into the South.
Booker T. Washington, because Booker Washington was born a slave. He grew up in this period of integration, and in his famous Atlanta Compromise speech of 1895, it's a speech essentially to Northern philanthropists, but they for the most part are industrialists. And he says that right now, it is more important that Black people in the South have an opportunity to get jobs than it is that they have the opportunity to vote. So to me, he's the key figure.
Oh, that's fascinating. Thank you. I'm going to go back and ask you for another individual person, because you've written about him. Ulysses S. Grant, seen through the history of American enterprise. What is Ulysses Grant from that history?
If one wanted to follow the thinking of somebody like Charles Beard, who talks about the Civil War as, well, sort of the triumph of Northern capitalism over Southern feudalism, then Grant is an agent of Northern capitalism. I don't see him that way. And I don't like making people unwitting agents of forces that they're not even aware of. So I don't see Grant primarily as an agent of any aspect of development, except that he is the single most important individual in the military victory of the North over the South, right, which ensures that the American economy, that is the economy of the United States, will remain a single market economy. If the South is allowed to secede, then it would be like Brexit on a larger scale, comparatively speaking. So instead of a single economy, there would be these two competing economies. Now, that's not to say that somehow they wouldn't come to a tariff union or something like that. But the fact is that if there's one single formula for the emergence of the United States by 1900 as the most powerful economy in the world, it's the continent-wide single market. And it is the US Constitution, as affirmed by the Civil War and by people like Ulysses Grant, that provides the legal framework for that. And then it is the Transcontinental Railroad and other railroads that provides the mechanical industrial framework for that. And that's what gives the United States the edge over all of its industrial competitors by the beginning of the 20th century.
And let me try him again from a different angle. His whole biography, going into the army, trying to make a failed living as a businessman, trying to do his memoirs. Do we get more insights out of all of these, history of enterprise and how he stands in for, the failed businessman? Well,
you mentioned his memoirs. The only reason Grant wrote his memoirs is he was swindled out of his life savings by a Wall Street scammer. And the only way that he could recoup his fortune and leave his wife other than destitute was to write this memoirs, which was the most successful memoir, certainly of the 19th century, but it was a direct consequence of this double dealing on Wall Street, which is quite standard. So Grant was as much a victim of American finance capitalism as he was its agent. But of course, in history, things usually play out that way. No one is solely an agent or solely a victim. We're all woven into the fabric of this, and the influences work both in many ways.
I'm going to go forward a bit to the 20th century. You mentioned a number of things which you ought to be understood through the lens of enterprise. World War II and post-World War II globalization being big. Just for the purpose of our interview, tell me about the civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s from the point of view of American enterprise.
Well, this is one where, well, this, again, like a lot of things in history, this is a knife that cuts both ways. Yes. So the civil rights movement of the 1960s opens areas of the economy to African Americans who had been excluded by Jim Crow laws. Just the simple matter of there were plenty of restaurants you couldn't go to in Austin, Texas, where I live, before 1965. And afterwards, you could. And so it, on paper, it integrates the American economy. And it's really primarily in the economy that most of the effects of the Civil Rights Act take place. The Voting Rights Act, of course, is a voting thing. And we often focus on schools, and that's important. But the main thing is that the Civil Rights Act says that businesses cannot exclude customers on the basis of their race. Okay, so that's a big deal. But one of the things that it does simultaneously, and you see there's an echo of what had happened in the South before the Civil War and during Reconstruction. Because the South had an economy apart, it didn't compete directly with Northern enterprises.
Right.
When Reconstruction comes along and integrates the two economies, and a lot of Southern businesses go out of business because of the competition from the North. The same thing is true. There was a Black economy in much of the country, in many cities of the economy where there was a large Black population in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And when Black customers can take their business to white businesses after the mid-1960s, a lot of the Black entrepreneurs go out of business. And so, as I say, developments in history very often have consequences that people either didn't foresee or didn't welcome when they were pushing a particular direction.
Do we, by the way, have a social history of people who would have been Black entrepreneurs? Do their children go into, say, the integrated multinationals instead?
That's a good question. I don't know what the answer is. I don't know if anybody's written on the subject directly. It might very well be in the literature of business or sociology for that matter. But it is an interesting question.
Yeah, and I guess getting this right to the present, I mean, you obviously must look at the current headlines and so on, but in fact, if I'm to look at the current political scene from the lens of the history of enterprise, what should I be paying attention to that isn't perhaps in the headlines?
One of the areas in which enterprise intersects politics again and again is when there are failures of the economy, or at least perceived failures by large parts of people who are trying to make a living. This occurred in the 1880s and 1890s, and it gave rise to the populist movement as farmers saw their livelihoods diminishing. They were basically the victims of automation of the agricultural enterprise. And there were too many farmers, and they were losing their jobs. Translate from farmers in 1890 to coal miners in West Virginia in 2016. And when the farmers in 1892 voted for the populist candidate, James Weaver, the coal miners in 2016 vote for Donald Trump, someone who says we're going to bring back your jobs. Now, in neither case could a candidate for elected office turn back the clock on industrial development, the Industrial Revolution then, and the tech revolution of the early 21st century. But when people feel that enter certain aspects of enterprise, when the economy is not working for them, when they can't make a living, when they can't make a secure living, then they turn to the tools of government. And this is where I'd emphasize that we often look sort of from government to the private sector, those of us who write history, because it's easy to do. It's easy to get your hands on, your mind around government. But very often, I think it's at least as enlightening to look the other way. So the emergence of the New Deal in the 1930s was not a plot by Franklin Roosevelt and the Democrats to foist this program they'd had for years and years on the American people, and now this is their chance. No, it was a response to demands from the American people. We need help. And what we're hearing now is that inequality has gotten to the point where folks who are just making it can see the very visible and egregiously wealthy lifestyles of people who have way more money than they could ever use. There might have been one or two brief examples in American history of people, legitimate candidates, proposing a wealth tax. Yeah, previously there were income taxes and there were property taxes and the like, but a wealth tax targeting not simply those people who are making money, but the wealthy. This is something we certainly are seeing in Democratic politics today, and it's a response to the fact that there are a lot of people, presumably the candidates believe, Democratic voters, who will respond to this because they're feeling that the economy is not working for them. One of the reasons that in American history there has been very little in the way of class politics. There has been very little of the really soak the rich approach toward taxation. And that has often reflected a belief that either I one day, or more likely my children, are going to be rich, and we don't want to have to worry about them being too heavily taxed. When we see this emergence of a wealth tax, to me, that's a signal that the people who support it, or the people who support it or think other people will support it, have basically written off their chances of becoming one of those wealthy. So again, it's that interplay between the economic side and the political side.
So when future historians look at journalists today, wanting the ones who will give them the material for the history of enterprise in America today, who are some good journalists to read?
Let me think about that. Walter Isaacson has a good biography of Steve Jobs. That would be a good place to start. Walter Isaacson is a wonderful historian and journalist. He was originally a journalist. He's written histories and biographies. He has a historical sensibility. And Steve Jobs is an iconic figure in this era.
Okay, all right, Isaacson, top of the list. This gets back to the modesty part. When you're doing the history of America, what doesn't the history of enterprise explain?
I would say there's a lot that it doesn't explain. There's very little it doesn't touch. But for example, the outcome of presidential elections is sometimes strongly influenced by the state of the economy or people's expectations of the economy, but sometimes it's determined by other things. And so, for example, if the economy had dictated the 2016 election, Hillary Clinton would have won because the economy was vastly improved over what it had been when Barack Obama became president. And usually it's the direction of the economy. But voters, or at least enough to elect Donald Trump, wanted to register a protest vote. So generally speaking, economics, the state of the economy, attitudes toward the economy are much better at explaining broad trends, long-term developments, than they are the specifics of the here and now, this particular moment. There's a lot of other stuff that enters into those.
And I guess, and getting back to something you said earlier, I take it you would say that every country could use a history of enterprise, but it's perhaps uniquely useful for the United States?
I wouldn't say it's uniquely. I'd say it might be peculiarly useful because I don't know that the leader of any other country said the equivalent of what Calvin Coolidge said. The business of America is business. And there were people who sort of mocked him for that. But he was pretty much right because for the most part, Americans historically have believed that they can do okay on their own. They can find a job, they can make a living, they can put their kids through school, they can do all this if government would just stay out of the way. Now, that's for the most part. There are times when they're happy to accept government help. And once a new government program is in place, then it just becomes part of their expectations. And so before Social Security was created in the 1930s, people saved for their own retirement. And one of the reasons that Social Security was put in place was they had saved their retirement and the banks went bust and they lost their nest eggs. So now that's just built into people's expectations. So you don't have to be a liberal to say that Social Security is a pretty good deal. Most people think that Social Security it exists, and there it is. So it's, we get used to these changing landscapes. But in terms of how the economy influences stuff and doesn't influence stuff, one of the points I make in the piece, the essay, is that it was the economy that gave the United States the ability to shape world affairs from the 1940s until, let's just say, the beginning of the 21st century. Because the United States had the discretionary income to throw around all the world and to fight wars and have a big military establishment and all this. It wasn't the economy that said the United States was going to fight in Korea. Various historians have said, yeah, it's the arms industry that says we have to defend Korea. No, those were decisions made by politicians for particular reasons at particular moments. And I certainly wouldn't try to explain that. But the idea that the United States could fight a war in Korea while still defending Europe against potential communist invasion, that's what the economy made possible.
How much, when you're talking about the economy, I mean, there's also the thought that, it's, human capital, particular initiative. I mean, it's not just that there's an economy happening. I mean, how much of your history is the talk about the discussion, analysis of what makes the economic history, of America, of each country individual?
Sure. So the economy is just a very rough shorthand for the economic activities of the people of that country. And very quickly, you've exhausted its usefulness. You need to get down to, okay, so what is, let's say, a culture of enterprise? And to take an example, and here's a really stark example, in the history of China and the Chinese diaspora, Chinese people were known as being fantastically successful entrepreneurs if they could simply get out of China. Yeah. And so when Chinese came to America, when Chinese went to Singapore, when Chinese went to South America, when they went to India, when they went to all sorts of places, the Chinese would be some of the most successful business folks. The only place they couldn't succeed as entrepreneurs was China after the revolution of 1949 until the late 1970s. But then Mao Zedong dies, and with him dies the original sort of communist vice on everything. And the Chinese government in China decides to let the Chinese be entrepreneurs. And the single most important success story, or maybe the single most important story of world history, has been the unleashing of the Chinese economy in China in the last 30 years. And so there's an example where there was always this kind of, I won't say always, but had long been a kind of Chinese culture toward entrepreneurism.
Right.
Entrepreneurialism, but it had been stifled by the political realm. So once it released, and then it gives rise to the enormous growth of China and the spillover effects in Africa and various other parts of the world as a result of that.
I'm going to shift the topic slightly. The historical profession. You mentioned, I think, that the history of enterprise is marginal, not the center of what historians study. And I think you said, in fact, that there's a sort of a distaste for money grubbing. I mean, is that do you want to lengthen on that, elaborate?
I think there's some of that. So in the history profession, and this is true especially since about the 1960s, there has often been what I see to be a conflation between sort of what historians study and what they find to be important and valuable.
Right.
And so, for example, military history, which for a long time within the academic profession and still today has been one of the most popular realms of history. You can sell books on the military history of World War II or the Civil War or the American Revolution. And Rick Atkinson has demonstrated you can do really good history this way and straight line military history. But academic historians pretty much gave up on the enterprise starting in the 1960s. And it's really hard to find people within the academy who do military history. And I think part of this is because during the Vietnam era, there was this notion that if you study something, you approve of it. So if you study the military, you're in favor of the war in Vietnam. I think it was overstated and a mistake, but it was there. Just to take another example, it was certainly the case that when history departments developed programs in women's studies, women's history, okay, you pretty much had to be a feminist in favor of greater women's rights. And it's certainly understandable why that was the case. But that spills over. So if somebody studies women's history or labor history, then you're in favor of unions and the like.
Right.
So, okay, if I want to study business history, I must be in favor of the boardroom. Now, that didn't have to be true. It wasn't true, although I will say this, that if you are going to spend time studying business enterprises, you certainly, if you don't already have it, you will probably develop a greater sympathy for what goes on in the boardroom than if you don't. And so for this reason, I think business history has largely gone begging. In fact, you find business historians sometimes at business schools, but it's interesting that business schools, started with Harvard's business school, which pioneered the case study method of teaching business. Well, case study, that's nothing but history. So we're going to look at the history of something. How did they do it? And where do we go from there? But I think that's one of the reasons that there is as little attention paid to as important a subject as I think the history of American enterprise is. And again, there also is this idea that to study American enterprise is to study American entrepreneurs writ large. So I'm going to write another biography of J.P. Morgan. We don't need another one of those. But I make a point in the essay of saying, everybody who goes out to his job or her job in the morning is engaged in American enterprise, and they're as worthy of study as anybody else.
How did you personally get into enterprise history?
Probably because I grew up in a family business. And I've seen...
What did your parents do?
My father, following his father, ran a cutlery wholesale and importing business in Portland, Oregon. And from the time I was 8 years old, I used to work back in the warehouse and pluck and wrap orders, and I worked as a traveling salesman for a while in the business. And so I saw that in the United States, that's the way most people make their living. Not necessarily running the business themselves, but the people who worked for the business, the people who worked in the warehouse, the people who delivered the stuff, the people who had the small hardware stores in rural Idaho that I would visit, the people who bought the knives that they used to slice the bread, all this stuff, that this is what provides, daily bread for Americans. And it included, in my case, it included some of the most fascinating people I've ever met. And I thought, okay, there's a great story to be told here. Now, I certainly haven't written the story in its entirety. My book, American Masters of Enterprise, tells the story of 25 entrepreneurs. Now, the ones that I chose eventually became successful. If I really wanted to do a good cross-section, I'd write about the 10 times as many who failed. But you got to sell books, so. Well, but actually, it also gets to a basic principle of history that distinguishes history from, say, writing historical novels, is that we historians are all prisoners of our sources. Right. And so I simply could not write the history of the 100 fashion businesses that failed for the one Liz Claiborne that succeeded. Because when they fail, they go out of business and their records are lost. One of the challenges of writing even about successful businesses is because they're not part of the public sector, they have no obligation to turn their records over to nosy historians. Right. When you write about people who are in public office, government offices, agencies, for the most part, eventually the stuff is going to get released if you're just patient. But if you want to study the history of Standard Oil, now ExxonMobil, they don't have to let you in. They have no obligation to do so whatsoever. And their lawyers tell them, basically, don't let those historians in. It's just going to be bad news. Right. Or you get the authorized histories, which are not worse than nothing, but they're certainly not as good as the best that they could be.
So I'm going to take it you have gotten into at least some business histories. And how did you get into the archives?
I've done next to no work actually in the corporate archives of businesses. But one of the ways that businesses do reveal, and I realize they're revealing what they want to reveal, is when they're proud of what they've done, right. Then they have an interview with Fortune or Forbes or magazine, or sometimes they'll hire a very able historian like Alan Nevins, and they'll write biography of somebody like John D. Rockefeller with access to the Standard Oil archives. So there's that part of it. But it is a challenge. Now, in fact, one can get access after the passage of the Securities and Exchange Act in the 1930s. Then there is public reporting that is required of publicly listed companies. But if you don't want to list your company on the stock exchange, then you don't have to tell anybody anything. Now, again, you can do interviews, you can talk to people, and there are things, well, so one of the big challenges, if you look at something like the Forbes 400 top corporations or the billionaires list, and you read through those with some skepticism because they're guessing, but these are people who make their living doing this kind of thing. So you, again, as every historian has to do with every kind of source, you evaluate it for what you think it's worth. You don't take anything at face value and just try to cross-reference it with other things.
Before I forget, is Brand's Cutlery still in business?
Well, the name that it did business as was Coast Cutlery Company, but it's dropped the cutlery, and so it's now Coast Products, yes, and it is run very successfully by my younger brother, who has made an enormous success of it. And Coast Products, well, it's, in fact, I've sometimes sort of thought about writing a history, not necessarily of that business itself, but use that business as a hook for writing the development of a certain aspect of American business, American enterprise, because it started in the decade of the First World War, and it started off as a very regional distributor at a time when shipping costs were high and the reach of sales reps was relatively small, until now it is this global company. And manufacturing centers are in China, its design centers are in Germany, and they sell products all over the world. So it is an example of globalization.
Lovely to know. Thank you. I'm going to go back to the history profession bit. When you look back, who are the historians whom, well, you admire for the history of American enterprise, whom you depend on? Your own canon.
Okay, so Alfred Chandler probably pioneered the study of the modern 20th century corporation. There have been histories of various corporations. I mentioned Walter Isaacson and Steve Jobs. The literature is really divided between the kind of case study, what can I learn from this and apply to my own business? So there is the business how-to literature.
Right.
Then there are the business biographies. So Ron Chernow has a wonderful book on the House of Morgan. Okay. It is focused on an individual and a family. And so there are those kinds. There are various biographies of people, Andrew Carnegie, Henry Ford. There are company histories. The company histories tend to be authorized versions. And so depending on how open-minded the individuals are who are responsible for opening the archives to the historians or the biographers or the journalists, you get degrees of candor. There are sort of the muckraker takes on businesses where somebody's going to take down a particular business. And so Ida Tarbell wrote a series of articles in McClure's magazine that was compiled into a book called The History of Standard Oil. Now, she had a personal stake in this because her father had a business in the oil industry. He'd been run out of business by John D. Rockefeller. So perhaps more often than in other areas of history, the histories are written either by the real friends of the enterprises or their enemies. To be that neutral party in the middle, just sort of observing, is probably less the case than it is in certain other areas of history.
That's a really interesting insight. Thank you. Looking to the future, when you give advice to graduate students who want to go into this field, and I'm going to assume there are some, please don't tell me that there are none. You must have advice you give in terms of how to go about it, in terms of research, how to get a job, everything that there must be to prepare you. What's the sort of advice you give?
First, to be very realistic about what your job prospects are going to be when you come out. It is a tight enough job market for PhDs in even the most popular fields of history. So to choose a field of history that is comparatively unpopular is a greater risk. Right. So for example, if somebody wants to study something in the broad realm of American social history, or something that is even, although political history per se is not popular today, but something that falls in that general realm, then you can look on the faculty of every college and university in the country, and you can see, yeah, they teach that here. And so if this person retires or that person leaves, there will be a job in that field. And that goes across the board. And these days, PhDs take jobs at community colleges.
Right.
Okay. So I have to be very candid with these potential students who might be studying business history that you can go down the rosters of most colleges and universities in the country, and you won't find somebody who teaches business history, at least not labeled that way. Or somebody who identifies himself or herself as a historian of business. Maybe they're a historian of something else and they teach a class in business history. But when that person is going to be replaced, the job description is probably not going to say business historian. And if you look for a job teaching at a community college, well, they're not going to be looking for a business historian. They'll look for somebody who can teach a U.S. history survey. And if you can do that as a business historian, that's fine. So there's that part of it. But I will tell you that what has happened in the past, and so in answer to your basic question, there aren't very many students who come looking to do that.
Right.
If they do, I think they're well advised to sort of business and some other aspect of history. So minorities in business or women in business or something like that. So they can present themselves to the job market as something plus.
Right.
But one of the things that happened, one of the most promising students I ever had was somebody who was going to write business history. And he got about halfway through writing his dissertation, business history, and he'd been hanging out with these business types. And he got offered a lot better job in business than he was ever going to get in the academic world. And he took the job. He didn't finish his PhD. And he's doing wonderfully well. So I'm good for him.
So his success is history's loss. Oh, well.
Right.
Yeah, no, I'm glad he did well out of that. I'm going to, I think, end the interview. I don't want to take your time unduly, but you had a wonderful bit about, and in fact, the American dream. The American dream has always been a material dream, and that in fact it's been inspirational for millions and millions, people within America, people coming to America, and I guess this. If I'm summing it up, I guess I would say that one could say that the 1619 project doesn't give enough weight to the American dream, and that part of the history of American enterprise is to show the weight of one aspect of the American dream. And sorry, this is the inspirational conclusion, but this is, I think, what an awful lot of people care, the civic reason for millions of Americans to care about this, that one wants to have history that isn't rah let us have nothing but trumpets, but which acknowledges the real seriousness of the American dream for people in their hearts, in their actions. This is my peroration. I mean, is this something close to what you would say?
Well, I agree with that. And I would add that it actually does link up with the 1619 project, because the reason that slavery was such an anomaly in the United States was that there was this American dream, and it was denied to millions of Americans explicitly for 250 years, and then implicitly and by de facto means for decades after that. And so, the dream exists. It doesn't exist equally for everybody. Nobody succeeds in the dream entirely, but the dream is there. That's what gives the fact that it does exist and holds possibilities for people, what gives it its power. At the same time, the fact that it hasn't been delivered equally to everybody is what makes it a source of, I think, what makes American history a source of continuing interest and importance. Because if the dream just was delivered to everybody all at once, then there's no story there. The story is struggling toward that dream, and we're still struggling.
Yeah. Okay. That, I think, is a wonderful way to end this. I should say, look, thank you so much for being interviewed. Thank you for being willing to talk to us.
Well, very good. I enjoyed talking to you very much.